But then there are the people like Nicole Hannah-Jones, the elitists within the Democratic Party. And she is taking aim, Michael, at the media's coverage of Ukraine as racist. She says, she's saying if you care, if you're particularly upset about what's happening in Ukraine, that's because of your racism. Mm-hmm. She is explaining that basically it's, hold on, I'm trying to find the exact tweet. That, okay. These admissions of shock that this is happening in a European country are ahistorical and also serve to justify the lack of sympathy for other invasions, other occupations, and other refugee crises involving peoples not considered white. And goes on to talk about the racialized analysis and language, that the reporters need to look internally because racialized analysis and language uncovering Ukraine is obvious. She doesn't like people referring to Ukraine as a civilized country. You did that in a tweet. She's probably going to say you're racist because that shows you only care about the Ukrainians because they're white.
Because they're white. And Nicole Hannah-Jones insists that we need to only focus on people with a history of slavery, which is ironic when we're talking about Slavic regions of the world, because last I checked, Slavic is where we get the very word slavery. But to take her point on its face, as you mentioned, Megyn, I got in trouble for a shocking, controversial, amazing tweet that I made that I did not think was controversial at all. Namely, this war between Russia and Ukraine is the first major war of my lifetime between civilized nations. There have been other minor wars. I think of the, Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, not a major war. Even Kosovo. I remember Kosovo quite well, but not a major war. When you look at the civilized part of things, left-wing flattery aside, I don't think anyone believes that Gaddafi's Libya was the most civilized place, or Assad's Syria. I don't think anyone is going to go honeymoon in Aleppo over Paris. The reason this matters, I'm not making any sort of value claim about the relative worth of Libyans versus Ukrainians. The reason it matters is because you're talking about a nuclear former superpower now conquering what had been a buffer state between Russia and Europe. World wars have started for much less than this, and you've got Putin, who is committing the invasion, is now actually threatening to use nuclear weapons. So the reason I mention this is because the global effects of this war, if it continues to escalate, as I think very stupidly the Europeans are encouraging it to right now, the effects could be catastrophic at a far greater scale than the relatively minor wars that we have seen for the past several decades.
Moreover, it's just not true to suggest that there's been no caring by the American people when war breaks out in countries where people aren't all white. I mean, you could go down the list. I was at Fox News covering most of them while they were happening. So this is another tweet that she sends out. What if I told you Europe is not a continent by definition, but a geopolitical fiction to separate it from Asia? And so the alarm about a European or civilized or first world nation being invaded is, wait for it, a dog whistle to tell us we should care because they are like us. Why are we listening to her about anything? How can any self-respecting American university employ this moron?
Well, Megyn, the thing about dog whistles is that the creatures that hear the dog whistles, well, they tend to be dogs. You notice the conservatives here, they're never the ones talking about these dog whistles. So you say, hold on, if you're hearing that, maybe that says more about you than it does about me. The irony, of course, with Nicole Hannah-Jones is that she is not a real historian. She is not a real scholar. She is a propagandist and a political activist. Actually, the main thing that she is known for is the 1619 Project from the New York Times, the central thesis of which was complete bunk and was debunked.
Michael, speaking of ahistorical, who is she to be throwing that term around?
Right. Her claim was that the American Revolution began to protect slavery in the colonies, and it's just not true. And even leftist academic historians pointed out it's not true. She's never really apologized. The New York Times sort of tried to retract it some months later, but they still spent millions of dollars pushing it.
They took out their little eraser.
Exactly. And it's not going to work. And so no one should take her seriously. And the only reason anyone really should care about what she says is because she's a very effective political activist who has transformed curricula around the country and totally misrepresented history and geopolitics. And unfortunately, when people are ignorant of history and geopolitics, you find yourself in sad situations, history repeating itself as tragedy and farce.